They partially step away while still keeping a thread of connection alive. They partially engage while maintaining emotional distance that feels confusing and powerful at the same time. In many relationships involving avoidant personalities, a strange pattern appears where love seems present in moments, yet full emotional closeness never fully arrives. Instead of choosing complete separation or full emotional bonding, they create a middle space that feels safe for them but emotionally intense for the other person. That middle space often takes the shape of friendship after romantic tension has already formed. This video reveals why this pattern happens and why it leaves people emotionally stuck for long periods without clear answers. By the end of this video, you will understand the psychological reasons avoidant individuals shift romantic energy into friendship, how their fear system activates when emotional closeness increases, and why maintaining controlled connection feels safer for them than full emotional commitment. You will also learn the hidden emotional effects this creates on the other person, including confusion, attachment loops, and the difficulty of moving forward when a connection still feels alive but incomplete. These patterns are rarely explained in simple terms, yet they shape many modern relationships more than people realize. There is a deeper emotional mechanism behind this behavior that connects to fear of vulnerability, self-protection instincts, and internal conflict between desire and emotional safety. As this video unfolds, you will begin to see how friendship becomes a psychological strategy rather than a simple social choice, and why this strategy often keeps both individuals emotionally linked even after romantic direction fades. There is a silent emotional tension inside these situations that many people feel but struggle to name, and understanding it can change how you interpret mixed signals, delayed affection, and inconsistent closeness. Stay until the end because the final part reveals the key turning point where avoidant attachment patterns either loosen or intensify, depending on how the emotional dynamic is handled, and this insight often changes how people respond to similar situations in their own lives. Before we continue, welcome to our channel where we explore deep psychological truths behind love, attachment, and human behavior in a simple and clear way. If you find value in understanding why people act the way they do in relationships, consider subscribing so you never miss future videos that break down complex emotional patterns into understandable insights. Avoidant individuals often experience emotional closeness in a very different way compared to others. When a connection begins to deepen, something internal starts to shift. It is not a lack of interest or absence of feeling, but a rising sense of pressure that comes with emotional dependence. The idea of someone becoming too important creates an internal discomfort that becomes difficult to ignore. Love, in its natural form, asks for openness, consistency, and emotional availability, and for someone with avoidant tendencies, this level of closeness can feel overwhelming rather than comforting. The intensity of romantic attachment does not simply feel warm or bonding to them, it can feel consuming, as if their personal space and emotional control are slowly being reduced. In contrast, friendship carries a very different emotional weight. It allows connection without the same level of vulnerability or expectation. There is care, there is communication, but there is also space. That space becomes essential for someone who struggles with emotional closeness because it gives them the ability to stay connected without feeling emotionally trapped. Friendship does not demand the same level of emotional exposure, so it feels lighter, more predictable, and easier to manage internally. It creates a sense of balance where they can still remain present in someone's life without triggering the internal alarm that romantic closeness often activates. Over time, when emotional intensity increases in a romantic direction, there is often a shift. Instead of continuing toward deeper emotional commitment, the connection is gently redirected into something more controlled. Love does not always disappear in these moments, but it is reshaped into a form that feels safer. This is where the transition into friendship begins to take place. It is not always a conscious decision made with clarity. It is more often an emotional adjustment made to reduce internal discomfort while still maintaining connection. The important part of this pattern is that it is not driven by emotional indifference. Feelings can still exist, sometimes strongly, but they are managed in a way that reduces emotional risk. The connection is not completely released, yet it is also not allowed to grow freely. This creates a structure where distance and closeness exist at the same time. The person remains accessible, but only within limits that feel emotionally manageable. Friendship becomes the space where this balance is maintained, allowing them to stay connected with avoidant attachment, develops as a form of self-protection that becomes deeply embedded in how a person processes emotional closeness. At the core of this attachment style is a heightened sensitivity to emotional dependence where closeness is not automatically experienced as comfort, but often as pressure. When emotional bonds begin to deepen, the nervous system can interpret this shift as a form of threat, not in a physical sense, but in a psychological one where personal space, independence, and internal control feel at risk. This internal response does not always appear on the surface, yet it strongly influences how relationships are managed. As emotional intimacy increases, the system reacts by creating distance. This distance is not always dramatic or obvious. It often appears in subtle adjustments, such as reduced emotional expression, limited availability, or shifting the nature of the relationship into something less intense. The purpose of this shift is not to disconnect from people entirely, but to reduce the internal stress that comes with emotional closeness. In this state, maintaining control over emotional exposure becomes more important than deepening attachment. Friendship becomes a structure that naturally supports this need for control. Within friendship, the emotional demands are lower and the expectations are less intense. This allows avoidant individuals to remain connected without feeling overwhelmed by constant emotional engagement. The level of distance can be adjusted at any time, which provides a sense of safety that romantic closeness often removes. There is room to step back when needed, without the pressure of maintaining a highly emotional bond. This flexibility becomes essential in regulating internal discomfort. Another important aspect is the reduction of expectations. Romantic relationships often carry unspoken emotional demands, such as consistency, vulnerability, and deeper emotional presence. Friendship removes much of that pressure, allowing connection to exist in a more manageable form. It creates a space where emotional involvement can be controlled rather than fully surrendered to. This sense of control plays a major role in how avoidant individuals sustain relationships without feeling overwhelmed. There is also the freedom factor, where disengagement does not carry the same emotional consequences. If things begin to feel too intense again, stepping back into emotional distance is easier when the bond is defined as friendship. This flexibility helps maintain psychological balance. The behavior is not random or careless. It is a structured response shaped by internal regulation, where maintaining emotional safety becomes the central focus of connection management, without entering the intensity of full emotional involvement. Most people interpret the shift into friendship as a clear and simple message that romantic feelings are no longer present, but the internal reality is often more complex than it appears on the surface. The assumption becomes that emotional interest has faded completely, and what remains is only a neutral connection without deeper meaning. However, in many avoidant dynamics, this interpretation misses a more layered emotional state, where feelings are not fully removed, but instead reorganized into a safer form of expression. The connection does not always disappear, it changes shape in order to reduce emotional intensity while still maintaining some level of attachment. In many cases, there is still ongoing mental and emotional engagement that continues even after the shift away from romance. Thoughts about the other person do not simply stop. Memories, emotional impressions, and subtle forms of attachment can still remain active internally. Care can still exist, sometimes more than what is outwardly shown, but it becomes carefully contained. Expression is reduced not because the feeling is absent, but because expressing it fully creates discomfort or emotional pressure. This creates a gap between internal experience and external behavior, where what is felt and what is shown do not fully align. Letting go completely can also be difficult in these dynamics. Emotional bonds do not dissolve instantly just because the relationship structure changes. There can be an ongoing internal pull, that keeps the connection psychologically present. At the same time, vulnerability becomes the central barrier. Emotional vulnerability requires openness, uncertainty, and a willingness to be seen deeply. And for avoidant individuals, this level of exposure often feels unsafe. It activates a sense of emotional risk that is difficult to stay within for long periods of time. Because of this internal conflict, a compromise takes shape. Instead of fully engaging with the intensity of what they feel, they often settle into a version of connection that feels more manageable. The relationship is adjusted into something that allows emotional distance while still preserving contact. In this form, they are not fully engaging with the deepest emotional version of the bond, but rather with a controlled version of it. The connection becomes filtered through emotional safety mechanisms, where only what feels manageable is expressed outwardly, while deeper emotional layers remain unspoken and contained. When someone remains in a connection that has shifted from romantic to something more undefined, emotional attachment does not simply disappear. The bond still exists in some form, and that presence alone is often enough to keep emotional involvement alive. Even when clarity is missing, the feeling of connection can remain strong enough to prevent detachment. This creates a situation where the relationship feels active, but at the same time lacks direction, making it difficult to fully understand what is actually happening between both people. Inside this space, emotional experience becomes inconsistent. There are moments of closeness that feel meaningful, followed by distance that feels confusing. Communication may still continue, attention may still be given, and emotional signals may still appear, but they do not form a clear pattern. This inconsistency creates a mental loop where interpretation becomes constant. Every interaction is analyzed for meaning, every shift in behavior is noticed, and every change in tone is felt deeply. The emotional system stays engaged because there is still enough connection to keep hope alive. This is where mixed signals begin to take shape. One moment can feel warm and engaging, while the next moment can feel distant or uncertain. This contrast makes it difficult to form a stable understanding of the relationship. Emotional confusion grows because there is no clear direction to follow. The connection feels real enough to matter, but unclear enough to question its purpose. In this space, hope does not fully disappear, but it also does not settle into certainty. It remains suspended between possibility and doubt. Over time, internal questions start to form naturally. Thoughts begin to circle around the same emotional uncertainty, trying to find meaning in the behavior being experienced. The lack of clarity leads to repeated reflection, where the mind tries to make sense of inconsistent emotional cues. These questions are not random, they are a response to emotional imbalance where attachment is present but direction is missing. This ongoing uncertainty becomes the central experience. The emotional bond keeps the connection alive, but the absence of clarity keeps it unstable. The mind stays engaged because something still feels personal, yet nothing feels fully defined. In this space, confusion does not feel like an interruption. It becomes part of the connection itself, shaping how everything is interpreted and felt. A common misunderstanding in relationships involving avoidant attachment is the belief that distance always comes in the form of rejection or emotional coldness. In reality, the pattern is often more subtle and harder to recognize. Instead of pushing someone away through clear separation or emotional shutdown, avoidant individuals can maintain a form of closeness that still preserves distance. The connection continues, but it is carefully regulated in a way that prevents full emotional merging. This creates a dynamic where presence and absence exist at the same time. In this pattern, the relationship does not always end or break. It often shifts into a different structure where emotional intensity is reduced, but connection is not fully removed. Friendship becomes the space where this balance is maintained. It allows interaction to continue without the demands that come with deeper emotional commitment. There is still communication, still awareness of each other's lives, and still a sense of bond, but it operates within boundaries that feel safer for one side of the dynamic. This middle ground serves a very specific emotional function. It prevents complete loss of the connection while also avoiding full responsibility that comes with romantic involvement. The person remains present in each other's lives, but in a controlled way that does not trigger emotional overwhelm. There is no full stepping away, but there is also no full stepping in. Everything stays in a managed space where intensity is softened and expectations are limited. From the outside, this arrangement can appear stable. There is no obvious conflict, no dramatic ending, and no clear separation. Communication may still happen regularly, and the relationship may even look functional on the surface. However, beneath that surface, the emotional structure is not fully balanced. The lack of clarity creates an underlying instability that is not always visible but is often felt by the other person involved. This is where the key pattern becomes noticeable. The connection is maintained in a way that avoids loss, but it also avoids depth. The relationship exists in a form that reduces emotional risk while keeping attachment intact. It becomes a carefully maintained balance where closeness is present, but only within limits that prevent full emotional exposure. At the end of this pattern, the most important truth is often misunderstood. Avoidant individuals do not always replace love with indifference or emotional emptiness. In many cases, the emotional bond is still present, but it is reshaped into something that feels safer to manage. The depth of feeling does not necessarily disappear, but the way it is expressed becomes limited, controlled, and carefully adjusted to avoid emotional overwhelm. This is why friendship in these situations is not always as simple as it appears. It can carry emotional weight that is not fully expressed, creating a quiet tension beneath the surface of the connection. Friendship in this context is not always just friendship. It can become a space where emotional attachment still exists, but without the capacity to fully experience or hold the intensity of romantic closeness. The feelings may be real, but the ability to stay with those feelings in a deep and consistent way is often restricted. This creates a situation where connection continues, yet something essential feels incomplete. That incompleteness is what makes the experience so emotionally complex for the other person involved. This is why confusion becomes such a strong part of these dynamics. When behavior still feels personal, when attention still exists, and when emotional signals are still present, it becomes difficult to interpret what the connection truly is. The experience does not clearly fit into separation, but it also does not fully exist as a stable relationship. It remains somewhere in between, shaped by emotional boundaries that are not always visible from the outside. At its core, this pattern is not always about a lack of feeling. In many cases, it is about the fear of feeling too deeply and losing emotional control. That fear shapes how closeness is managed and how relationships are maintained. The result is a dynamic where love and safety rarely exist in the same space at the same time. There is either distance that protects emotional stability or closeness that feels controlled and limited. If you found value in understanding this emotional pattern, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel.